This is the unknown zone, where the shadows of war do not fade, they simply change shape. When Nazi Germany fell in 1945, the world believed the nightmare was over. The cities burned, the armies surrendered, the swastika came down. But in the ruins of Hitler's empire lay something far more dangerous than tanks or rockets. Knowledge. Thousands of pages of scientific research, advanced weapons designs, prototype missiles, experimental aircraft, and the minds that created them. And while the world celebrated victory, another war began in silence. A secret struggle for the scientists who once served the Third Reich. This was not the end of Operation Paperclip. It was the beginning. In the final months of the war, American intelligence officers scrambled across Germany, searching for scientists, engineers, and technicians whose work had shaped the Nazi war machine. They were not looking for soldiers. They were not looking for generals. They were looking for ideas. Ideas that could define the future. The United States wanted radar specialists, aviation designers, chemists, physicists, doctors, and mathematicians. Anyone whose research could be weaponized. It didn't matter where they came from. It didn't matter what they had done. What mattered was what they knew, and what the Soviets were willing to do to get to them first. Because Stalin wanted the same scientists, the same documents, the same secrets. The Cold War had not begun on a battlefield. It had begun in laboratories and underground bunkers, in files stamped Geheim and Top Secret, in scraps of paper pulled from bombed-out buildings. And as the Allies divided Germany, they divided its scientific empire as well. In May 1945, the Allied powers held a conference to determine what would happen to German science. The decision was simple: disarm, dismantle, and deny the enemy the ability to wage war again. But behind closed doors, American military planners saw something else. An opportunity, a chance to take the brightest minds of Germany and bring them to the United States. Not as prisoners, but as weapons of the future. These scientists would not be tried. They would be hired, given new names, new homes, new identities, and their pasts, however disturbing, would be rewritten. This program would eventually become known as Operation Paperclip. Its name came from the simple paper clips attached to the files of special candidates, marking them for recruitment instead of interrogation. But what began in wartime under urgency would evolve into something much larger, a long-term strategy that shaped generations of military power, aerospace dominance, and Cold War intelligence operations. The story did not end when the war ended. The war simply changed forms. By 1946, hundreds of German scientists had already arrived in the United States. They were placed in secure military facilities: Fort Bliss in Texas, White Sands in New Mexico, Wright Field in Ohio. Their mission was simple: take everything they had learned under Hitler and rebuild it for America. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, the weapon that had terrified London and Antwerp. To the world, the V-2 was a weapon of terror. To von Braun, it was a stepping stone to space. Now, under American supervision, he and his team began building missiles for the U.S. Army, rockets that could fly higher, faster, and farther than anything built before. Missiles that could carry warheads across continents. This was the first spark of the Cold War arms race. And it began with scientists who had once sworn loyalty to Adolf Hitler. But von Braun was only one piece of a much larger puzzle. The United States recruited experts in aerodynamics, chemical weapons, biological warfare, jet propulsion, advanced materials, aviation medicine, nuclear physics, radar and communication systems. Every field that could strengthen America or weaken the Soviet Union was considered vital. Some of these men had participated in horrific experiments. Some had overseen slave labor. Some had belonged to the SS. Their pasts were buried under classified documents. Their crimes were erased behind new identities. And in their new laboratories, they worked not with fear, but with freedom. Freedom protected by the same government that had fought against them only months before. The ethical contradictions were never discussed publicly. The files remained hidden. The truth stayed buried. Because in the Cold War, morality was not the priority. Survival was. Meanwhile, across the ruins of Eastern Germany, the Soviets began their own operation. They raided factories, emptied research institutes, and forced entire families onto trains bound for the Soviet Union. Operation WWII, the Soviet counterpart to Paperclip, relocated more than 2,000 German specialists to secret research cities. There, behind locked fences and armed guards, they rebuilt the weapons Germany had once dreamed of, but now for Stalin. The Soviet atomic program, the jet program, the early missile designs. All of them were strengthened by German knowledge. The Cold War was being shaped not by American and Soviet scientists alone, but by the captured legacy of Nazi Germany. By the late 1940s, the United States realized something critical. Operation Paperclip could no longer remain a temporary wartime measure. It had to become permanent, because the Cold War was not a conflict of today. It was a conflict of tomorrow. A struggle for the skies, for the oceans, for the atom, and for whatever technology came next. This required more than a handful of engineers. It required an entire network of German scientific talent, deeply embedded into the American military-industrial system. And so the recruitment expanded. Dozens became hundreds. Hundreds became thousands. Operation Paperclip was no longer an operation. It was an era. But behind the progress, behind the missiles, behind the new laboratories rising across America, there was a truth that could not be spoken. A truth locked inside classified rooms. That the Cold War was being built on knowledge taken from a fallen empire. Knowledge that came at a terrible cost. Knowledge that had once been used to wage war against the world, and now it would shape the world to come. After the war ended, the American public believed that German science had been defeated, that the laboratories of the Reich had been reduced to rubble, and that those who built its weapons now sat in prison cells waiting for justice. But behind closed doors, a very different story was unfolding. The United States was quietly assembling one of the most powerful scientific forces in modern history, made up not of American researchers, but of German engineers, doctors, and physicists. This was the hidden engine of Operation Paperclip. Not the recruitment of a few scientists, but the reconstruction of America's scientific future using the minds of an enemy nation. The most prominent of these men was Wernher von Braun. Before the war, he had dreamed of sending rockets into space. Under Hitler, he built the V-2, the world's first long-range ballistic missile. Now, in America, his dream and his past collided. Von Braun and his team were moved to Fort Bliss, Texas, a barren desert landscape where they began their new lives as U.S. government employees. Their task: rebuild the German rocket program under American command. They worked in isolation. They lived in military housing. They were monitored constantly, and yet they had more freedom than they had under the Reich. At White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico, von Braun's team launched modified V-2 rockets into the sky, gathering data on propulsion, upper atmosphere physics, and missile control. Each launch pushed American military technology forward. Each blueprint they drafted widened the gap between the United States and the Soviet Union. It wasn't long before Washington understood something profound. These men were not temporary assets. They were the foundation for America's missile program and eventually America's space program. While von Braun worked in the desert, other scientists were sent to centers across the country. Aviation experts were placed at Wright Field in Ohio, where they studied German jet engines, swept-wing aircraft, and pressurized cockpits. Their research influenced the designs of early American jet fighters, aircraft that would dominate the skies of the Korean War. Chemists and materials scientists were sent to Aberdeen Proving Ground, where they rebuilt German processes for synthetic fuels, advanced plastics, and high-strength metals. These innovations fed directly into America's growing industrial power. Doctors who had conducted experiments in aviation and extreme physiology were assigned to the U.S. Air Force School of Medicine, where they studied the limits of the human body in high-altitude flight. Their research shaped the early field of aerospace medicine, the science needed to put humans into space. Mathematicians and radar experts were placed at laboratories in New Jersey and Maryland, where they refined German systems for tracking aircraft and guiding missiles. Their work would soon be integrated into America's air defense network, guarding the nation during the peak of nuclear tension. The United States did not simply adopt German knowledge, it absorbed it. It rebuilt itself around it. But Operation Paperclip was not without controversy. And the deeper the program expanded, the darker the truth became. Many of the scientists recruited had been members of the Nazi Party. Some had held ranks in the SS. Some had overseen factories that used slave labor. Some had conducted experiments on prisoners at Dachau and other camps. These facts were known to American intelligence. They were written in the scientists' own files. And yet, their pasts were erased with a paperclip. A simple marking on a folder indicating that their records should be altered, their affiliations removed, and their crimes concealed. Background checks were rewritten. Biographies were sanitized. Official histories were redrafted. The United States needed their expertise more than it needed accountability. That was the calculation. That was the bargain. Inside the Pentagon, a new vision was forming. A vision of a military built on advanced science, guided by the very men who once strengthened Nazi Germany. Von Braun's team was only the beginning. The United States soon brought over guided missile designers, chemical weapons researchers, jet propulsion specialists, submarine acoustics engineers, nuclear physicists, biological warfare researchers. They came under new names, new identities, and new passports. Their children were enrolled in American schools. Their families moved into suburban neighborhoods. Most Americans never knew who their new neighbors really were. The secrecy protected them. The Cold War justified it. By the late 1940s, von Braun's team had already achieved what American engineers could not: successful long-range rocket flight. Their work laid the foundation for the Redstone missile, America's first operational ballistic missile. From Redstone came Jupiter C, the rocket that launched America's first satellite. And from Jupiter came the Saturn series, the rockets that would carry humans to the moon. History would one day call Wernher von Braun the father of the American space program. But that title carried a shadow, one that the public would not discover until decades later. Meanwhile, in laboratories across the country, other German scientists quietly reshaped America's technological future. Radar systems improved, missile guidance became more precise, jet fighters became faster and more agile, submarines became quieter, explosives became more powerful. Medical research advanced at a pace the world had never seen. America was becoming a scientific superpower, and it was doing so with the minds of men who had once served a regime of brutality. Operation Paperclip was no longer just a recruitment program. It was the backbone of America's Cold War strategy, the unseen force behind aerospace dominance, nuclear deterrence, and technological supremacy. And as this new scientific empire grew, so did the moral questions buried beneath it, because the scientists who rebuilt America did not come without a cost. As the United States moved German scientists into military bases, research labs, and secret test ranges across the country, another power was doing the same, but with far less subtlety. The Soviet Union did not negotiate. It did not offer contracts, new homes, or citizenship. It used force. Its answer to Operation Paperclip was an operation of its own, an operation that would reshape the Cold War just as profoundly. This was Operation Osoaviakhim, a massive coordinated sweep across Soviet-occupied Germany, carried out at night under armed guard and under absolute secrecy. In October 1946, Soviet soldiers surrounded entire neighborhoods, pounding on doors in the early hours of the morning. Engineers, physicists, machinists, technicians, and their families were ordered to pack whatever they could carry. They were given 1 hour. Those who refused were loaded onto trucks anyway. Trains lined the stations, waiting with engines rumbling in the fog. Carriages were filled to capacity. Not with prisoners, but with specialists who once worked for the Reich. They were transported deep into the Soviet Union, to closed cities surrounded by fences, guards, and watchtowers. Cities that did not appear on any map. These scientists would not go home again for years. Some never returned at all. The Soviets had done what the Americans feared most. They had captured the industrial and scientific heart of Eastern Germany. Factories in Leipzig, Chemnitz, Dresden, and Jena were dismantled piece by piece. Entire production lines were packed into crates and shipped east. Machine tools, turbines, precision instruments, all taken. The Soviet Union had lost millions of lives in the war, but now it was absorbing the technical expertise it lacked. Where the United States recruited German minds, the Soviets seized German industry. And their goal was clear: build a nuclear bomb and build it fast. The race for nuclear dominance, a race that the United States believed they had already won, had entered a new phase. While von Braun's team built rockets in the desert, Soviet physicists worked alongside German researchers on uranium enrichment. German chemists rebuilt laboratory processes for heavy water, gas centrifuges, and reactor materials. German metallurgists improved Soviet production of high-strength alloys needed for bombs, missile airframes, and jet engines. German aerodynamicists redesigned Soviet rockets and aircraft, influencing early Soviet missile systems and the foundational designs that would later become the R-7 rocket. the rocket that launched Sputnik, and German specialists played a quiet but critical role in the creation of the first Soviet atomic bomb, tested in 1949, a full decade earlier than many US strategists expected. The world had assumed America's monopoly on nuclear power would last. It did not. The Soviets had closed the gap with terrifying speed, and the truth was simple: they hadn't done it alone. As this rivalry intensified, both the United States and the Soviet Union realized that German science was not just valuable, it was essential. The technologies of the future, ballistic missiles, nuclear warheads, jet fighters, guided weapons, radar networks, and long-range rockets, were tied directly to Germany's wartime advances. The two superpowers were not just building on their own foundations, they were building on the ruins of the Third Reich. For every scientist who boarded a ship to the United States, another boarded a train to the Soviet Union. The Cold War was not a battle of ideology. It was a battle of intelligence, knowledge, and the ability to weaponize the discoveries of the past. As the Soviet Union expanded its scientific empire, American intelligence became increasingly anxious. Reports from Europe suggested that the Soviets had captured thousands of German technicians, far more than the US had estimated. Entire aviation research centers had been relocated, entire missile labs transported, entire chemical facilities rebuilt behind the Iron Curtain. But the most alarming news came from deep inside the Soviet nuclear program. American analysts learned that Soviet physicists were working with uranium samples and designs nearly identical to those found by Operation Alsos. The Germans had not built the bomb, but they had laid a foundation that any determined superpower could use. The foundation the Allies had feared during the war was now being used in the Cold War, and the advantage America believed it held was shrinking. To counter the threat, the United States accelerated its recruitment. More German scientists were brought over. Their backgrounds were hidden behind classified files. Their skills were fed into missile projects, chemical weapons labs, and early intelligence programs. Operation Paperclip was no longer just a tool. It was a race against the very same nation that had captured the other half of Germany's scientific power. The world was splitting in two, not just politically, but technologically. And the battleground was no longer Europe. It was the future itself. As the Soviets advanced their nuclear program, their rocketry program grew even faster. German specialists working under Sergei Korolev contributed to the design of engines, guidance systems, and aerodynamic structures. Meanwhile, von Braun's team in America refined larger, more reliable rockets, each test bringing them closer to breaking the boundaries of the atmosphere. Two powers, two systems, two visions, each built on the knowledge of a defeated nation. The Cold War rivalry was now unstoppable, and the German scientists who had once worked for Hitler were now shaping the destiny of the world's new superpowers. By the early 1950s, the United States understood that the greatest threat of the Cold War would not be fought with tanks or infantry. It would be fought with missiles that could cross continents, reach the edges of space, and carry destructive power beyond anything ever imagined. To win this new war, America needed ideas that did not yet exist in its laboratories, ideas that had been born decades earlier in the minds of German engineers. And so, under the shield of Operation Paperclip, the US began building a missile empire, an empire constructed largely by the same men who had once designed weapons for the Third Reich. The center of this empire was the group led by Wernher von Braun. After years of test launches at White Sands, his team was moved to a new headquarters, Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville, Alabama. This would become known as Rocket City, a place where German engineers and American soldiers worked side by side, designing machines capable of altering the balance of global power. The first major success was the Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V2, but more powerful, more accurate, and built for a new era. The Redstone became the backbone of America's missile forces. It would later carry the first American astronauts into space. But it was only the beginning. The next step was the Jupiter series, medium-range ballistic missiles with longer reach and greater precision. The Jupiter C version of this rocket would launch Explorer 1 in 1958, America's first satellite. A triumph that helped restore U.S. confidence after the shock of Sputnik. Every stage of these rockets carried the fingerprints of German engineering. Guidance systems refined in German research centers. Propulsion concepts first tested on V2 prototypes. Aerodynamic shapes developed in wind tunnels once controlled by the Luftwaffe. America's early missile and space programs were not just influenced by paperclip scientists, they were shaped by them. But rockets were only one part of the story. Elsewhere, German scientists were working on technologies that would define the modern battlefield. Infrared missile seekers, early cruise missile guidance, high-altitude flight research, hypersonic wind tunnel testing, satellite trajectory mathematics. In underground laboratories in Peenemünde, Germany had once developed weapons years ahead of their time. Now those same designs were being revived, this time under American flags. American engineers learned quickly that German research had been far more advanced than the world realized. The V1 cruise missile, dismissed by some as a primitive terror weapon, was actually one of the earliest examples of pulse jet propulsion. Its guidance system formed the basis for future cruise missile design. The V2 had reached the edge of space, decades before the world even knew spaceflight was possible. These designs were not relics. They were blueprints for the future. Operation Paperclip had not just captured scientists. It had captured time, years of research the United States would have otherwise needed to develop on its own. Yet behind this success were deep ethical contradictions. Many of the German engineers working on American missile systems had overseen forced labor in subterranean factories during the war. At Mittelwerk, thousands of prisoners died constructing V2 rockets. These facts did not appear in their new files. They were omitted, altered, or removed entirely. In many cases, U.S. intelligence intentionally softened or erased references to war crimes, fearing that prosecution would end the scientific advantages the United States had gained. The official story presented these scientists as brilliant researchers forced to work under Nazi rule. The truth was far more complex. Some had been enthusiastic participants in the regime, others were opportunists. A few were apolitical, but fully aware of the suffering their work caused. In the name of national security, the United States chose to ignore these truths. A new narrative was created, a narrative in which the past could be rewritten as long as the future was useful. Meanwhile, tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union escalated. Nuclear stockpiles grew, missile tests increased. Jet aircraft pushed beyond the sound barrier. And through all of this, the scientists of Paperclip were at the center of American progress. In 1950, the U.S. Army formally established the Army Ballistic Missile Agency, placing von Braun and his team in direct control of America's long-range missile development. They tested new fuels, improved guidance systems, and designed rockets capable of reaching altitudes far beyond what the world believed possible. Their competitor on the other side of the world, Soviet chief designer Sergei Korolev, was working with his own team of German specialists. The rivalry between these two forces would define the technological race of the 20th century. Missiles were no longer just weapons. They were symbols of national power. Whoever dominated the skies would dominate the world, and Germany's lost scientific legacy had become the foundation for both sides. But the most dramatic chapter of Paperclip was yet to come. The moment when von Braun's rockets would leave the atmosphere, when war machines would become space machines, and when the competition between two superpowers would become a race to the stars. The Cold War was expanding beyond Earth, and the same minds that once built weapons for Hitler were now preparing to take America into space. By the mid-1950s, the Cold War had evolved into something far bigger than a battle for territory, ideology, or even military power. It had become a battle for the future, a struggle to control the sky, the atmosphere, and eventually space itself. And at the center of this struggle were the scientists of Operation Paperclip. The same men who once built rockets for Hitler were now building the machines that would carry the United States into a new age. The missile race was transforming into the space race, and Germany's scientific legacy was about to change human history. The turning point came in 1957. For years, both the United States and the Soviet Union had been developing satellite technology in secret. Both sides were close. Both sides were testing, but the world was stunned when the Soviet Union struck first. On October 4th, 1957, a polished metal sphere crossed silently over the Earth. It emitted a simple radio beep, a sound that could be heard around the world. This was Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite in human history. For the first time, a human-made object had left the planet. It was not American. It was Soviet. The world had changed in a single moment. Americans panicked. The U.S. government realized that the Soviet Union had achieved the impossible. They had placed a satellite into orbit using a rocket powerful enough to deliver nuclear warheads across continents. The newspapers called it the Sputnik crisis. Politicians demanded answers. Military leaders demanded funding. Scientists demanded new programs. The United States needed a response, and they needed it fast. And in the middle of this pressure stood Wernher von Braun, the German engineer who had been waiting for this moment for years. Von Braun had warned American officials that he could launch a satellite quickly if they would simply allow him to move forward. He had the rockets, he had the knowledge, he had the team, but he had been restricted, politically, personally, morally, because of his past. Sputnik changed everything. The Pentagon gave von Braun permission. His team rushed into action, modifying the Jupiter C rocket they had been using for test flights. On January 31st, 1958, less than 4 months after Sputnik, the United States launched Explorer 1. As the rocket rose from the Florida coast, the world held its breath. Minutes later, a signal was received. Explorer 1 was in orbit. America had entered space. The crisis eased. The space race had officially begun. and it was being led by men whose careers began in Nazi Germany. After the success of Explorer 1, the US government realized that space exploration could no longer remain under military control alone. It needed a dedicated civilian agency, an organization that could unite science, engineering, and national ambition. And so, in 1958, the United States created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. Within months, von Braun and his German team were transferred from the Army Ballistic Missile Agency to NASA's new Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. For the first time, the men of Paperclip were no longer just military engineers. They were the architects of the future. The next goal was clear: human spaceflight. But to put a man into space, NASA needed rockets far larger than anything used before. Von Braun proposed a new series of rockets, the Saturn family, powerful enough to reach Earth orbit and eventually the Moon. His team designed engines, fuel systems, stabilizers, and structures that would become the foundation of American space power. And while the public celebrated these rockets as symbols of American ingenuity, their origins were rooted in German wartime research. The Saturn rockets were descendants of the V2. Their architecture could be traced back to Peenemünde. Their creators had once worn the uniforms of the Reich. History rarely moves in straight lines. Sometimes it curves in unexpected ways. But even as NASA made progress, the Soviet Union remained one step ahead. In 1961, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space. Another Soviet victory, another American shock. The United States responded with urgency: new funding, new training programs, new facilities. President John F. Kennedy delivered a bold challenge. America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended. It was a promise that sounded impossible. It was a race that America was losing. But NASA had something the Soviets did not. The team of engineers brought to the United States under Operation Paperclip. Von Braun and his scientists were already working on the rocket that could make the moon landing possible. A giant unlike anything ever built. This rocket would be called the Saturn V, a machine taller than a 36-story building, with engines more powerful than any in human history, and a design that pushed engineering to its absolute limits. The Saturn V was the culmination of everything von Braun had done, from his early experiments in Germany, to his wartime work on the V2, to his breakthrough designs in America. It was the moment when the shadow of his past intersected with the light of human achievement. As the 1960s progressed, NASA tested engines, fuel tanks, and control systems. Failures happened, explosions happened, but each setback was a step closer to success. The space race was more than a contest of technology. It was a contest of ideology, a test of which system, democracy or communism, could achieve the impossible. And behind this contest stood men whose lives were marked by contradictions, men who had once served a dictatorship and were now helping a democracy reach the stars. The world did not know this. Most Americans did not know this. Their backgrounds were hidden in classified archives. Their pasts were rewritten. Only their achievements were celebrated. Because in the Cold War, victory mattered more than history. As NASA marched toward the moon and the Soviets pushed deeper into space exploration, the stakes of the Cold War rose higher than ever. Space was no longer just a frontier. It was a battlefield of prestige, symbolism, and scientific superiority. And at its center was the legacy of Operation Paperclip. By the mid-1960s, the Cold War had consumed every corner of human ambition, from the oceans to the skies, from intelligence networks to nuclear stockpiles. The United States and the Soviet Union were locked in a contest without boundaries. But one battleground towered above all others, a place untouched by war, untouched by politics, and untouched by history: the moon. And the race to reach it was being led by men who had once served a fallen regime, men whose pasts had been erased, whose names had been rewritten, and whose scientific legacy had been absorbed into the dreams of a new superpower. This was the paradox at the heart of Operation Paperclip, and nowhere was that paradox clearer than in the story of the Saturn V. The Saturn V was more than a rocket. It was a statement, a declaration that the United States could exceed the limits of engineering, defy gravity itself, and reach beyond the sky. It stood 363 feet tall. It weighed over 6 million pounds. Its engines generated the power of dozens of battleships. And the team that designed it, the engineers who shaped its stages, calculated its thrust, and refined its systems, included dozens of paperclip scientists. Wernher von Braun led them. The same man who had once built weapons for Hitler now led America's charge to the moon. History does not erase itself. It only finds new directions. On July 16, 1969, the Saturn V stood on the launchpad at Cape Kennedy. Steam billowed from its sides. Flames roared beneath it. The countdown reached 0, and the most powerful machine ever created by human hands lifted off the Earth. 4 days later, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface and spoke the words that would echo through time. Millions watched. Nations paused. History shifted. The United States had won the space race. It had achieved what no civilization had ever done, and the world celebrated. But behind the cheers, behind the triumph, behind the global admiration, there was an unspoken truth. The road to the moon had been paved, in part, by men whose work had once fueled the ambitions of a dictator. The knowledge that lifted Apollo 11 was born in laboratories of war and refined in secret government programs that would remain classified for decades. Operation Paperclip had succeeded, but its success carried a shadow. In the years that followed, America continued to expand its space program. Von Braun became a national icon, appearing on magazine covers, television broadcasts, and documentary films. His German past was rarely mentioned. His wartime activities almost never discussed. The narrative was simple. He was a visionary, a pioneer, a man who brought humanity to the moon. The deeper complexity, the moral question of using former Nazi scientists, was buried beneath the accomplishments. But outside the public spotlight, historians began to uncover the truth. Documents surfaced, testimonies emerged, evidence of forced labor, ethical violations, and complicity with the Nazi regime became impossible to ignore. The story of Paperclip was no longer one of pure scientific triumph. It was a story of compromise, of strategic necessity, and of a world willing to overlook darkness in pursuit of victory. This is the moral weight of Operation Paperclip, a weight still carried by the history of modern science. And yet, the scientific achievements were undeniable. America's early missile systems, its aerospace medicine, its jet propulsion research, its satellite technology, and its moon landing were all influenced, in part, by the knowledge brought from Germany after the war. This influence did not make the scientists heroes. It did not excuse their pasts. It did not rewrite the suffering caused by their work under the Third Reich. But it reveals a truth the world often forgets, that the foundations of our modern era were built not only by progress, but by decisions made in the shadows. Operation Paperclip did not just shape America, it shaped the Cold War. It shaped the space race. It shaped the technological world that followed. And its legacy lives on in every rocket, every satellite, every space mission, and every system that grew from those early designs. This has been the unknown zone, where the lines between past and future blur, where the truths of history hide beneath the victories of nations, and where the shadows of war stretch farther than we ever imagined. Operation Paperclip was more than a mission. It was a crossroads, a moment when science, morality, and power collided. It built rockets that reached the moon. It built missiles that threatened the world. It built an age defined by both fear and possibility. History remembers the achievements, but in the quiet, beneath the surface, the questions remain. This is the unknown zone, where we reveal the stories the world tried to forget.